No one in the palace knew what the Duke of Ashmore had truly agreed to the night he signed the marriage contract. Not the lords who toasted his name with raised crystal, not the countesses who whispered behind their ivory fans, not even the woman he was about to make his wife. They said he married her to stop the bleeding, the gossip that had carved through London's finest drawing rooms like a knife through silk. A scandal involving his late brother, a ledger of debts, a rumored illegitimate heir. The Ton had feasted on the Ashmore name for months, and Richard Caldwell, the 5th Duke of Ashmore, had grown weary of being their meal. He needed a wife, quickly, quietly, someone unremarkable enough to shift the story, but respectable enough to restore his family's dignity. What he did not need, what he had never once anticipated, was her. Miss Elara Voss arrived at Ashmore Hall on a grey October morning with nothing more than a trunk of modest gowns, a spine made of iron, and eyes the colour of winter rain that seemed to look straight through every wall he had ever built. She was the second daughter of a country vicar, chosen not for her fortune or her bloodline, but for her silence. Her family was grateful, her reputation was clean, and she, the Duke had been assured, would cause no trouble. He had been catastrophically wrong. The engagement was arranged in a fortnight. The wedding took place in 6 weeks, a quiet ceremony in the Ashmore Chapel, attended only by essential witnesses and the cold November wind that rattled the stained glass windows. Elara stood at the altar in her mother's ivory gown, altered quickly by a seamstress in the village, and did not tremble. She had made her peace with this arrangement. She understood what she was, a solution, a signature on a document that would quiet the mouths of London and grant her family a measure of security they had never known. She had promised herself she would not expect more. Richard, for his part, barely looked at her during the ceremony. He was composed, as always, tall and severe in his charcoal coat, dark hair swept back with military precision, jaw set as though carved from the same stone as the hall's ancient walls. He spoke his vows in a low, measured voice that betrayed nothing, no warmth, no reluctance, simply a man completing a transaction. And yet, for just a moment, when the vicar pronounced them married and Elara finally raised her eyes to meet his, Richard Caldwell looked at her as though she had said something unexpected, as though her silence, her steadiness, her quiet refusal to shrink from his gaze had startled him somehow. He said nothing, he looked away, and Elara told herself it meant nothing at all. Life at Ashmore Hall was magnificent and cold in equal measure. The house sprawled across 3 wings and contained more rooms than a person could reasonably inhabit, yet the Duke seemed to occupy only a handful of them: his study, his library, the dining room where they took meals in polite and excruciating silence. Elara explored the rest on her own. She discovered the music room on the 2nd floor, half covered in dust cloths, a pianoforte standing in the corner like a forgotten ghost. She uncovered it on a Tuesday afternoon and sat down without ceremony and began to play. She did not know the Duke had stopped walking in the corridor outside. She did not know he stood there for the full duration of 2 pieces, hands loose at his sides, head slightly bowed, before something in his expression shifted and he walked away without a word. But before we follow him into that darkened library, and before you discover what he wrote in his private journal that same evening, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the Duke's Lost Letters. Every subscription helps this channel continue bringing you unforgettable Regency romance stories filled with secrets, heartbreak, and forbidden love. Now, back to Ashmore Hall, where something irreversible had already begun. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly, without either of them intending it, the silence between them changed texture. It softened. Elara began leaving books on the corner of the dining room table. Nothing deliberate, she told herself, simply titles she had finished. Richard began reading them. One morning she found a slim volume of poetry beside her breakfast plate, with a single sentence written in a bold, unfamiliar hand on the inside cover. Page 43, tell me what you think. It was the first real thing he had ever said to her. She read page 43 3 times. Then she wrote back, not a polite acknowledgement, not a safe observation, but a genuine, slightly impassioned argument about the poet's use of grief as a structural device. She left it on his desk without knocking. He responded the same evening, 2 full paragraphs. She could feel the restraint in his sentences, the way he was holding something back, the way his intelligence and his loneliness were both visible in equal measure between the lines. They began to talk, carefully at first, through paper and ink, as though the written page was somehow safer than the space between them across the dining room table. Then gradually, haltingly, in person, a question over supper, a response in the doorway of the library, a disagreement about Wordsworth that lasted 40 minutes and ended with both of them laughing, briefly and somewhat surprised, as though laughter in this house had become a foreign language they had both unexpectedly remembered. Richard Caldwell, Elara was learning, was not the cold man she had married. He was a man who had taught himself to be cold, because warmth, in his experience, had only ever made him vulnerable, and vulnerability, in the Ashmore family, had always been punished. The letter arrived on a Thursday in Edinburgh, and it bore the seal of a solicitor in Edinburgh, and it was addressed to the Duke. And when Richard opened it at his desk, with Elara present by pure coincidence, she had come to return a book, she watched the colour drain from his face in a way that frightened her. He did not share its contents immediately. He folded the letter with careful hands, he set it down, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, not the guarded composure, not the restrained warmth, but something rawer and more dangerous. He said, very quietly, "It appears my brother left rather more behind than debts." The letter revealed the existence of a child, a son 3 years old, born to a woman in Edinburgh whom the late Duke of Ashmore had promised to marry and then abandoned when the family forbade the match. The woman had since passed. The boy had no legal claim to the Ashmore name, but if his existence became known, and the solicitor made clear that certain parties were already aware and were prepared to use it, the scandal would not merely wound the family, it would destroy it entirely. And someone, it seemed, had already been selling that information, someone with access to Ashmore Hall, someone trusted. It was his secretary, a man who had served the family for 11 years, who had been quietly feeding details to a journalist in London, piece by piece, in exchange for a sum that suggested he had been planning this for a very long time. The full scope of the betrayal came out in a single devastating afternoon, and Richard received it standing in the center of his study, utterly still, as though stillness was the only thing keeping him upright. Elara stayed. She did not leave the room. She did not offer hollow comfort or practiced consolation. She simply remained, present, steady, real, and when Richard finally turned to look at her, draw tight with something he had never learned how to release, she said only, "Tell me what you need." No one had ever asked him that before. He chose to acknowledge the child publicly, not quietly, not strategically, but honestly, before the solicitor could use the information as a weapon. He petitioned to become the boy's legal guardian. He wrote the announcement himself, in language that was dignified and unashamed, and when the ton reacted with their predictable mixture of scandal and fascination, Richard Caldwell stood before it, without flinching. Elara stood beside him. She had not been asked to, she had chosen to, and that distinction, small, enormous, did not escape him. The night after the announcement ran in the papers, Richard found her in the music room. The house was quiet. The fire had burned low. She sat at the pianoforte, but was not playing, only resting her hands on the keys as though drawing something from their stillness. He sat beside her on the bench without speaking. They remained like that for a long moment, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her in the cold room. Then he said, "I married you to silence a story." "I know," she said. "I did not expect," he continued with the careful precision of a man who was choosing every word as though each one cost him something, "that you would become the only voice I wanted to hear." Elara turned to look at him, and Richard Caldwell, 5th Duke of Ashmore, who had built his entire life around the art of feeling nothing, looked at her without walls, without armor, without the cold composure that had kept everyone at a safe and manageable distance for so very long. He reached for her hand on the keys. She let him take it. "Then hear me now," she said softly, "because I have rather a great deal to say." They brought the child, a boy named Thomas, with the late Duke's dark eyes and none of his cruelty, to Ashmore Hall in early spring, when the grounds were beginning to green, and the house felt, for perhaps the first time in years, as though it might contain living things. Thomas took immediately to the music room. He took immediately to Elara. And Richard, watching his wife kneel in the garden with his nephew on her shoulders, laughing at something the boy had said, with her whole face and no restraint whatsoever, felt something shift in his chest that he suspected was entirely permanent. That evening he found a book on the corner of the dining table. Inside the cover, in her handwriting, was a single line. Page 1. We are only just beginning. If this story moved you, if you found yourself somewhere in the silence between Richard and Elara, in the letters exchanged across a cold dining table, in the love that grew not despite an arrangement, but through the quiet, stubborn courage of two people choosing to be honest with each other, then you already understand what this channel is built on. Subscribe to the Duke's Lost Letters and share this story with someone who believes in love that is earned, not inherited. Until next time, some love stories are too powerful to remain buried.